You are not a good person. You are not exceptionally kind or empathetic. What society labels as your gentle nature masks a brutal physiological fact. This is not a charming personality trait. This is a highly sophisticated neurological trauma response. Your chronic politeness is a survival script. It is executed by a terrified nervous system. Your habit of yielding to the external world is destroying your biology at a cellular level. This chronic appeasement is essentially slow suicide. Your physical body is paying a lethal price for your psychological defense. Watch closely how these people react. A mid-level employee sits in a Friday afternoon meeting. The manager asks who can take on an uncompensated weekend project. The employee's internal impulse is screaming no. But here is the brutal physical reality. The command bypasses the prefrontal cortex entirely. Before any conscious thought occurs, their hand is raised. Their breathing pattern instantly mutates. Air is trapped in the upper chest, becoming shallow and rapid. The masseter muscles around the jaw involuntarily lock and harden. To signal harmlessness to a predator, the vocal cords automatically contract. The vocal pitch is forced higher to sound non-threatening. A socially compliant smile is plastered across their face. In just 2 seconds, their resting heart rate spikes from 70 to 110. They have completely dismantled their own biological defenses. Just to regulate the microscopic social tension in that room, the actual fatal mechanism is this total loss of control. The conscious mind is desperately resisting. So what pathology deep inside the brain hijacked their vocal cords? What forced their throat to produce that fatal yes? People-pleasing is not a personality trait. In biology, this is the Fawn trauma response. The underlying logic is remarkably crude. It is identical to a wild animal playing dead before a predator. It is a primal survival instinct. When a child is raised in an environment of conditional love or extreme volatility, their brain's threat detection center, the amygdala, physically mutates. The amygdala codes any form of external disapproval as a lethal survival threat. Faced with this threat, the brain does not activate the sympathetic nervous system, because for a toddler, fighting an adult means absolute annihilation. The actual fatal mechanism is the forced takeover by the nervous system. The vagus nerve immediately triggers a hybrid survival mechanism. The brain instantly releases a flood of endogenous opioids. These chemicals act as high-concentration anesthetics. They directly sever the individual's psychological pain receptors. Simultaneously, the prefrontal cortex is forced to shut down. This is the area responsible for logical boundaries and self-identity. The biological organism is stripped of autonomy. The brain issues a single command: exhibit absolute compliance to down. Regulate the aggressor's nervous system. Watch closely how these people react in physical reality. A 7-year-old boy is drawing at the kitchen table. He hears his father's heavy footsteps in the hallway. He hears the aggressive metallic clinking of keys. The boy's muscles instantly lock. His pen hovers in mid-air. His pupils dilate rapidly, tracking his father's micro-expressions like a radar. He detects a microscopic tightening between his father's eyebrows. The boy immediately sweeps his drawing materials off the table in complete silence. His spine automatically curves. His shoulders collapse inward. He physically shrinks his spatial volume to reduce his presence. Then he quickly pours a glass of warm water and hands it to his father. He preemptively neutralizes the adult's rage before it escalates. This daily neurological training leads to catastrophic physiological consequences. The developing brain forms a hardwired neural circuit. It permanently binds safety to absolute subservience. To maintain this terrifying state of hyper-vigilance, the organism's own biological signals are forcibly erased. Hunger, extreme fatigue, anger from boundary violations. These survival alarms are completely blocked by the system. The nervous system enters a state of permanent dysregulation. This brutal childhood survival strategy prevents physical harm, and it gets worse. What happens when this obsolete, hyper-aroused code is dragged into adulthood? What happens when it is weaponized by a society that feeds on compliance? What happens to this severely compromised physical body? The adult pleaser does not give out of emotional surplus. This is a pathological identity fusion. You have become a mandatory emotional regulator for parasitic environments. But here is the brutal physical reality. Your brain structure has already undergone organic deviation because you were forced into extreme emotional surveillance during childhood. Your mirror neuron system is in a permanent state of toxic overload. You have fundamentally lost the psychological boundary between self and other. When a pleaser perceives someone else's negative emotion, the anterior cingulate cortex in their brain lights up instantly. This is the core region that processes physical agony and social tearing. You are not merely sympathizing with their sadness. You are experiencing substantial, visceral, physical pain in your own body. You exhaust yourself trying to soothe those who constantly take. It has nothing to do with high moral standards. You are just trying to anesthetize the excruciating pain projected by your own nervous system. Watch closely how these people react in daily life. At 11:30 p.m., a phone screen lights up in the dark. It is a long, complaining text from an acquaintance. The woman receiving it is utterly exhausted. Her eyelids are drooping heavily from muscle fatigue. Yet upon seeing the text, her pupils reactively focus. Her thumbs furiously strike the keyboard. She rapidly outputs highly validated, empathetic reassurance. During the excruciating 3 minutes waiting for a reply, she exhibits severe sleep apnea. Her chest completely stops rising. Her eyes are fixed on the typing indicator at the top of the screen. The cortisol concentration in her blood is spiking at a lethal rate, until the screen finally displays the word "thanks." Only then does she sharply gasp for air. Her shoulder muscles, stretched to their absolute limit, gain a microscopic physical release. The actual fatal mechanism is this absolute physiological depletion. A biological system cannot sustain infinite output with zero input. The chronic secretion of cortisol and adrenaline is shattering her immune defense. The physical body begins to suffer unexplained pathological crashes, stubborn migraines, incurable gastrointestinal spasms, severe autoimmune ulcers. The entire internal structure is undergoing a silent, continuous systemic inflammation. And it gets worse. Biological flesh has its limits. When the physical body is completely drained, the subconscious generates a dark, covert defense mechanism to prevent biological death. Unconditional compliance inevitably breeds deeply hidden resentment. You are turning yourself into a suppressed, psychological, explosive. You are a highly dangerous biological threat to yourself and everyone around you. But here is the brutal physical reality. Every human organism possesses a foundational biological imperative. The imperative to violently protect its own survival resources. When you constantly override this imperative to appease the outside world, your brain generates massive cognitive dissonance. Your dopamine reward circuits are actively starving to death because the external validation you buy with obedience is synthetic. It is a cheap, temporary stimulus that provides zero actual survival satisfaction. Meanwhile, your primal aggressive drive has not vanished. It has been forcefully shoved into the deepest layer of the subconscious. The biological purpose of anger is to establish physical boundaries. To forcibly suppress this protective anger requires immense caloric energy. This high-pressure containment cannot hold forever. The continuous accumulation of internal pressure guarantees a catastrophic psychological rupture. Watch closely how these people react. A man just agreed to let his invasive in-laws stay in his house. For 3 weeks, he now stands alone at the kitchen sink, washing dishes. There is laughter in the living room. No one offers to help. His jaw is clamped shut. His right hand grips the sponge so hard, his knuckles turn dead white. His chest cavity is locked. His breathing has practically stopped. In this exact second, his cerebral cortex generates a vivid high-definition image. He imagines violently smashing the ceramic plate in his hand against the wall. He wants to use extreme physical destruction to force everyone out of his territory. Exactly 2 seconds later, a violent wave of physiological nausea hits him. Accompanying this nausea is a suffocating, overwhelming sense of guilt. Simply because his brain generated an aggressive thought, he begins frantic self-punishment. He immediately dries his hands and walks out of the kitchen. He asks the people in the living room, if he can bake them a dessert right now. The actual fatal mechanism is the complete shattering of the persona. The nervous system can no longer maintain any equilibrium. It begins oscillating violently between extreme hyperarousal and complete hypoarousal. 1 second, you erupt into terrifying, destructive rage over a dropped hair. The next second, you plummet into severe clinical depression. You sink into physical paralysis, emotional apathy, and total anhedonia. And it gets worse. When both the biological system and psychological defenses reach total collapse, reality leaves you with a brutal binary choice. Either continue this absurd performance of compliance until your body shuts down forever, or execute a terrifying psychological surgery on yourself. To eradicate this pathological fawn response, you must personally execute a psychological death sentence. You must execute the carefully curated, socially acceptable good person. You must accept a brutal physical reality to reclaim a sovereign biological body. You are destined to become the villain in the eyes of those who drain you. Disappointing others is not a side effect of your recovery. It is the absolute biological metric of your healing. Every single time you say the word no, you are physically rewiring the neural pathways inside your brain. You are forcibly cutting off the amygdala's false alarms. You are decoupling external disapproval from biological death. The actual fatal mechanism is your habitual surrender to guilt. Enforce the 48-hour cortisol tolerance protocol. The next time anyone makes an invasive demand, your vocal cords are only allowed to output one rehearsed, mechanical script. I will check my schedule and get back to you. Do not apologize. Do not provide a single rationalization. Initiate a physical retreat immediately. For the next 48 hours, your bloodstream will experience a violent cortisol spike. This physiological agony that makes you want to crawl out of your skin. Society calls this guilt. Do not attempt to cure this guilt. Treat it purely as a severe clinical withdrawal symptom from a chemical addiction. Force yourself to sit still. Purely observe the abnormal acceleration of your resting heart rate. Observe the extreme tightness deep in your chest cavity. But absolutely do not pick up your phone to send a text of compliance. Use these 48 hours of physiological torment. Force your nervous system to execute a hard reboot and recalibration. The world does not need your self-erasure. It needs your absolute, authentic physical presence, even if that presence violently disrupts the artificial peace. If you are tired of your nervous system being held hostage, if you are ready to stop merely surviving and start existing, subscribe to this channel. There are no sugar-coated placebos here. We only dissect the brutal truths of human behavior. We only present the physical mechanics of reality. See you in the next one.